The 1970s didn't glide into New York. They crashed through the turnstile without paying. Sirens in the distance, subways scrawled with rebellion, and 1,000 disco balls spinning above cracked linoleum dance floors. The skyline stayed the same. But the ground, it shifted. Times Square flickered like a fever dream. Porn theaters next to soul food diners. Neon signs humming like promises they couldn't keep. You walked fast, kept your hands in your pockets, and hoped you wouldn't see something you'd have to explain. But you looked anyway. The subway trains groaned with rust and rhythm. Tags bloomed across their silver bellies like desperate prayers. T-Kid Stay High, 149. Lee. Some wrote for fame. Some wrote just to prove they existed. You rode the A train with your hood up and your ears full of Curtis Mayfield. The walls vibrated. So did your spine. Kids jumped hydrants in the South Bronx while smoke curled from a building 2 blocks down. You didn't ask why it was burning. You just moved the game to the next street. Rubber soles slapping pavement, skipping puddles of gasoline and glass. Childhood and chaos held hands without apology. Brooklyn block parties were kingdoms. DJs hauled crates of records down cracked sidewalks. Extension cords stretched from fire escapes. Speakers buzzed, turned up until the windows rattled. And when the beat dropped, Grandmaster Flash Sugar Hill, even just a James Brown loop, the whole street lifted off the ground. You could get a slice for 50 cents. Greasy folding served on a paper plate that barely held it. You ate it walking with the tip drooping toward your sleeve. Grease dripping between subway grates. And even when the city smelled like garbage and hot pavement, the pizza made it all make sense again. The blackout of '77 came like a thief and left like a riot. Stores looted, radios stolen, refrigerators dragged out onto the sidewalks. But neighbors also shared candles, checked on elders, pulled kids inside. The city was broken, but never truly empty. Never without some stubborn flicker of light. Your corner bodega kept a bat behind the counter. The guy behind the register didn't smile much, but he remembered when you were short a nickel. And when your mom was sick, he'd hand you the eggs with a grunt that meant more than a thank you ever could. Studio 54 hadn't yet become legend. It was still just a rumor. But on some Friday night, you stood in line behind a man in a feather boa and a woman in a sequined jumpsuit and thought, whatever happens inside, I want to feel it. You didn't always get in. Sometimes the sidewalk was the party. You learned to walk fast and look down, but also how to hear a saxophone from a fourth-floor window and pause just long enough to believe in something again. The city didn't invite tenderness. It dared you to find it anyway. The Greek diners on Queens Boulevard stayed open all night. Chrome counters coffee, burnt to the bottom of the pot, and laminated menus as thick as the Sunday paper. The waitress called you baby whether you were 16 or 60. And when she refilled your mug with that bitter dark roast, you knew everything was going to be okay, at least until sunrise. Cassette shops popped up on every corner. Window displays were cluttered with boomboxes, unlabeled mixtapes, and sun-faded posters of Farrah Fawcett, Al Pacino, and Donna Summer. You pressed your face to the glass, watching the tape spin in slow, hypnotic loops. If you had $2.99, you walked out with a soundtrack. If you didn't, you memorized the track list anyway. In Alphabet City, music poured from open windows, jazz, punk, salsa, soul, all in the same block, sometimes the same building. A guy on the third floor blasted Fania All-Stars. The guy below him shouted for silence. The street didn't care. It danced, whether you had a stereo or not. The apartments weren't warm, but they were loud radiators that hissed like angry snakes' neighbors, who argued like stage actors, and babies who cried on cue. You learned to sleep through sirens, to recognize your floor by the smell of garlic varnish and laundry starch. Home wasn't quiet. It was consistent. Graffiti wasn't just on subway cars. It was on mailboxes, alley walls, rooftop vents. You tagged your name in places no one else could reach, not for fame, but for proof. You existed. You mattered. Even if your only audience was pigeons and peeling paint. You could still buy a pretzel from a sidewalk vendor, hot salted, served in a sheet of wax paper, handed over with a shrug. Some were chewy. Some were rocks. All of them tasted better when eaten with dirty hands leaning against a lamppost, the city rushing past you like it didn't notice. But it always did. Your friend's basement was a nightclub. No license, no exit signs, just two colored bulbs, someone's older brother spinning vinyl, and a fan propped in the window. You danced in socks, screamed. The lyrics kissed someone you barely knew, and felt like you were glowing from the inside out. The stoop was your stage. You practiced monologues from Taxi Driver, recited lines from All in the Family, tried to sing like Roberta Flack. No audience but your cousin and the dog across the street. But somehow, it mattered. The concrete under you, the summer air, the belief that maybe someday someone would listen. Newsstands sold the world. The Village Voice, the Daily News Jet Cream, and whatever underground zine some NYU kid had stapled the night before. The guy behind the counter knew more than any professor. He didn't talk much, but he slid you the latest Bowie interview like it was a sacred text. You could hear the Mister Softee truck even in winter. The jingle echoed off brick and metal, soft and strange in the cold. He didn't stop often, but once he did, just as snow began to fall. You bought a cone with chocolate sprinkles and stood there, shivering and laughing, eating joy in the middle of a frozen street. Movie theaters in the 70s were cathedrals of grain and grit. You paid $1.25, stepped over popcorn, stuck to the floor, and found a seat with springs that poked through. The projector clicked like a distant train, and the reel marks danced in the corners of the frame. You didn't care. Taxi Driver. The French Connection. Mean Streets, the city, watching itself on screen, unfiltered, unafraid. The Williamsburg Bridge never slept. At 2 a.m., you could still hear tires humming metal, clanging a saxophone from a rooftop jam session floating through the fog. Lovers leaned on railings without speaking. Graffiti spelled out promises that wouldn't survive the next rain. But in that moment, with the skyline pulsing in the dark, they believed. Your dad said, "This ain't music," whenever you played Zeppelin or The Clash. He turned up Sinatra or Celia Cruz just a bit louder. You rolled your eyes. He shook his head. But on Sundays, while dusting off the record player, you both sang along to Sam Cooke, just once, and never admitted it. The TV became your family's storyteller. You all sat in silence, eyes fixed, plates in your laps, watching All in the Family Roots MASH, or the nightly news, where anchors told you the world was broken but still moving. No one spoke during commercials. You just listened to the ticking of the radiator and the rustle of napkins. Some apartment buildings had courtyards with broken benches and swings that squeaked like old jazz notes. Kids played tag in coats too big for them. Mothers leaned out windows shouting names like poetry. A ball hit the fire escape. A pigeon flapped off. And life continued in rhythms only that courtyard understood. You knew a kid who knew a kid who knew someone in a band. They played CBGBs once, or said they did. You went just to say you had. Inside, it smelled like sweat spilled beer, in the beginning of something unpolished but true. You didn't love the music. You loved the noise, the nerve of it. Sidewalks were full of voices, street preachers with megaphones, poets yelling verse over the rumble of trucks, revolutionaries selling newsletters. Some you ignored, some made you pause. One guy handed you a folded paper that read, "Be more than what they call you." You kept it. The library on 42nd Street still held magic. Even as the city frayed around it, the reading room stood tall, hushed golden, with dust and intention. The lions out front wore grime like badges. You studied beneath chandeliers and forgot for a moment how loud your life was outside those walls. The mail came late, often bent, but when it was a letter, not a bill, it meant something. An aunt in Jersey, a cousin drafted, a boyfriend from Queens who'd moved to LA and still signed his name with a star. You read it twice, then folded it like scripture and hid it in your drawer. You could still hail a cab by whistling loud and bold. The driver didn't always stop, but if he did, you climbed in and named a street, not an address. He grunted, turned the dial on the radio to AM salsa or 1010 winds, and drove like every second of your life depended on it. Gas stations glowed like altars in the dark. Buzzing fluorescent lights, oil stains on concrete like abstract art, and an attendant named Joe who wore fingerless gloves even in July. He cleaned your windshield with 3 swipes and said, "Try to avoid 5th tonight." You didn't ask why. You just nodded. He always knew. The cafe on McDougal Street didn't have a name, just a chalkboard out front and a door that stuck in winter. Inside, the tables wobbled, the coffee was too strong, and the poetry nights were half brilliant, half unbearable. But you went anyway, because once, just once, someone read a line that made you cry without knowing why. In the housing projects, elevators stalled and radiators hissed like snakes with secrets. But doors stayed open. Neighbors knocked. You borrowed sugar aspirin and ear. Laundry rooms were confessionals. Hallways held the scent of adobo hair grease and the quiet dignity of people doing their best. Popcorn didn't come in bags. It came from dented stovetop poppers shaking above blue flames. Some pieces burned, some barely popped, but the smell meant movie night. You sat cross-legged on the floor, your little brother leaning against your shoulder, watching Jaws on a rented VHS with tracking lines that danced like ghosts. Record stores were sanctuaries, vinyl bins deep as oceans, a clerk who looked like he hadn't slept since '68, but could quote every Miles Davis solo. You flipped through covers like tarot cards, hoping one would speak to whatever your week had broken. Sometimes you bought something just for the artwork. Sometimes it changed your life. Fire escapes were front porches. You sat there with a bowl of cereal, with a cigarette, with a journal, with a friend. Your knees touched through the rust. You heard a couple arguing 2 floors down. Somewhere a dog barked. The city was behind you, below you, beside you. But for a moment, it felt still. The corner store cat had one eye and a limp, but ruled the place like royalty. He slept on the bread shelf, swiped at kids who tried to pet him. The owner claimed he'd survived 2 fires and a blackout. You believed it. He was mean, but he was yours. Church basements smelled like wax and old books. Folding chairs, dusty pianos, bake sales that raised $37, and hope. You went there for youth group, for AA meetings, for bingo nights where someone's grandma always won. You didn't believe in everything they said upstairs, but downstairs, you believed in community. Coats were patched, handed down, heavy with stories. Yours still had your cousin's name inside. A button was missing, the lining torn, but it kept you warm mostly. And when you wore it, you felt connected to a family that stretched across boroughs and basements and birthdays with Entenmann's cake. Hot dogs from street carts weren't just food, they were rituals. You picked the cart that steamed the most. Yellow mustard onion sauce, sauerkraut if you felt brave. You ate it walking with grease on your napkin and hope in your step. No table, no silverware, just hunger and asphalt and joy. The Kodak shop on 9th Avenue smelled like chemicals and patience. You dropped off a roll of film with shaky hands, waited a week, and came back to see your life printed in naughty, grainy colors. Some shots were blurred, some were perfect, but each one felt like proof that you had lived. Bus stops in winter were little theaters of waiting. Breath fogged the glass, shelter scarves, wrapped tight around necks and mittens, clutched tokens like lifelines. Sometimes the bus came late. Sometimes not at all. But you stood there anyway, shoulder to shoulder, with strangers all pretending you weren't cold. Parent-teacher conferences meant freshly waxed hallways, nervous fathers with ties too tight, and mothers holding their purses like shields. Teachers spoke in soft but serious voices. He's bright but distracted. She has a gift for stories. You sat outside the door, legs swinging, praying they only mentioned the good parts. Snowball fights didn't care about weather alerts or frozen fingers. Kids ran into the street, packing slush into ammo-dodging cars with a speed that would terrify your parents. Someone always came home soaked, shivering with a ripped glove. Someone always swore it was worth it. Playgrounds turned into frozen fortresses. The metal slides burned your skin, even in the cold, and the monkey bars were slick with frost. You climbed anyway, because that's what kids did. You came home with red cheeks, a runny nose, and the taste of winter still on your lips. Corner diners had fogged windows and hot chocolate that burned your tongue. You didn't care. The whipped cream melted too fast, and the waitress always smiled like she'd been expecting you all day. Outside, the plows roared. Inside, someone played Sinatra on the jukebox, as if warmth had a soundtrack. You learned to ice skate on a frozen patch of pond in Central Park, wobbling like a baby deer. Older kids laughed. You ignored them. The city skyline glittered beyond the trees, and for a moment, you forgot the world was anything but this. The cold air, the scrape of blades, the sound of someone clapping just for you. The first snow day of the year felt like a holiday. Radios announced it in crackling voices. All public schools are closed. You cheered, grabbed your boots, and ran outside before breakfast. The streets were quieter, softer, like the city had turned down its volume just for you. Shovelers rang doorbells, offering to clear the sidewalk for $1 or $2. You watched from the window as they chipped away at ice breath rising in clouds. Your mother always tipped extra. They're just kids, she'd say. You didn't tell her you wanted to do it too, just for the thrill of being out there. And when the city thawed, when the first puddles formed and the snow turned gray and slushy, you felt that bittersweet ache, the one that comes when something beautiful ends and you know you'll spend the rest of the year waiting for it to come back. On hot summer nights, the city played its own mixtape. Somewhere, a window cracked open with a click, and then came the bass, slow, steady, irresistible. Donna Summer, Earth, Wind, and Fire, the Tramps. The buildings pulsed with rhythm. The sidewalks tapped their feet. No one asked who started the party. Everyone joined in. In the East Village bars came alive after midnight. Graffiti on bathroom stalls, bartenders with chipped nail polish and chain-smoking laughs. A man in a velvet jacket swore he'd open for Bowie next year. A girl with green eyeliner recited poems into her whiskey. You believed them. For one glittering hour, you were them. Roller skates clicked across pavement like applause. You wore cut-off shorts and tube socks your laces barely tied. Car alarms were rare, so the streets belonged to you. You glided past bodega's fire hydrants and the old woman who always shouted, "Careful," like she meant it. You waved. She smiled. The city made room for joy. The subway in the 70s was a story you didn't tell your parents. Dim lights, broken fans, graffiti like battle cries. Sometimes you saw things you weren't supposed to. Sometimes you were the thing someone else remembered later. But the train always came late, loud alive, and you rode it like it knew your secrets. Pizza parlors stayed open late on Sunday. You waited in line behind cabbies, punks, kids, in prom dresses. The oven roared like it had somewhere to be. You got your slice, hot and floppy, and ate it standing under a streetlight, sauce on your chin, grease on your wrist, happiness in a cardboard triangle. Community pools shimmered like promises. Chlorine in the air. Screams that weren't fear. Radios perched on windowsills, blasting La Freak and Rock the Boat. You dove in with your eyes open. Let the water erase whatever the week had done to you. For 10 seconds, you were weightless, invincible, clean. Fireworks popped from rooftops, even when it wasn't the 4th. Someone's cousin always had a stash. You climbed the fire escape with a bag of Doritos and a warm can of Tab, waited for the sky to bloom. The explosions echoed between tenements. Nobody called the cops. Everyone just watched. Public parks became living rooms. Families dragged out folding chairs, and Tupperware old men played dominoes under trees. Kids chased pigeons until someone cried. A boombox played September, and a toddler danced like it was gospel. You laid back on the grass, arms behind your head, and let the city breathe around you. Someone always sold ices from a shopping cart. Paper cups, shaved ice, neon syrup, cherry that stained your lips, lime that made your eyes squint. You handed over a quarter, took 2 steps, and heard the jingle of another cart coming. Summer never ran out, just changed flavors. And when the heat finally broke, when the clouds rolled in, like smoke from a distant fire, the whole city sighed. Fans clicked off, windows closed, and you fell asleep to the memory of music still echoing in your bones. Newsstands stood like sentinels at every other corner, metal skeletons stuffed with headlines and hope. The Daily News screamed in bold letters, "Ford to city drop dead," while the Post offered crime scandal and crossword puzzles in the same breath. You paid your quarter, flipped past the politics, and found your horoscope because some futures still mattered. Cabbies didn't ask where you were going. They just looked at you, nodded once, and hit the gas. The vinyl seats stuck to your thighs in summer. The air freshener smelled like regret, but they always knew a story about a mob boss, a blackout, a girl who vanished. You listened. You never asked if it was true. There were 24-hour bodegas long before anyone called them that. Fluorescent lights flickered. Shelves leaned. Cats napped beside chewing gum and bread. You came in for milk and left with batteries, matches, and a conversation in broken Spanish. The cashier might not smile, but he'd always say, "You safe tonight, yeah?" And somehow, you were. The radio by your bed was your confessor. AM static, midnight jazz, lonely callers on late-night talk shows. You turned the dial slowly, like cracking a code. And when the right voice came on, soft, certain, alive, you let it speak into your darkness. You didn't feel so alone. The laundromat smelled like steam detergent and someone's cheap cologne. Kids spun inside dryers until their mother caught them. You sat on a cracked bench, watching your socks go around and around, wondering how your life got so tangled. A stranger handed you a magazine without a word. You said thank you. It meant more than it should have. Elevator graffiti, read like teenage scripture initials carved beside heart's threats, scratched in ink, hope whispered in red marker. "One day, I'll leave this place," scrawled above the floor buttons. You touched it with your finger once, not to smear it, just to feel the truth of it. The city had a way of feeding you when you didn't ask. A guy on the corner handed out bagels at 5 a.m. Day olds, he said, but they were warm. A soup kitchen on Avenue B served rice and lentils with a side of kindness. The lady who ran it called everyone "hon" and made you feel full before the first spoonful. You bought bootleg records from a guy with a table near Astor Place. No sleeves, no guarantees, just a Sharpie on white label and his word that it was live from the '76 Palladium show. You listened that night, scratchy and raw, and believed it was real because the city had taught you to trust magic even when it skipped. The public library's book drop clanged like thunder. You returned books late every time. But the librarian never charged you. Better late than never, she'd say, sliding your card through like a priest blessing a sinner. Her lipstick was always too bright. Her mercy was always quiet. And sometimes, walking home past 2 a.m., with no one else on the street but a man sweeping the sidewalk and the smell of last night's rain still in the air, you felt something rise in your chest. Not fear, not nostalgia, something in between. Like the city was pausing just long enough for you to catch up. The first video rental stores didn't have rows, they had piles. Clunky plastic cases with stickers that read, "Be Kind, Rewind." You ran your fingers along the titles, Jaws, Rocky, Saturday Night Fever. If you were lucky, the tape worked. If not, the screen turned to snow, and the whole room sighed. You rewound tapes with a pencil when the player jammed, spinning the reels back by hand while your little brother watched with reverence as if you were defusing a bomb. You told him it was a secret skill. He believed you. So did you a little. In Central Park, Music was free. Blankets on the lawn. Hot dogs wrapped in foil. The hum of 1,000 quiet conversations before the first note rang out. Summer concerts with the city as backdrop. Simon and Garfunkel New York Philharmonic. A jazz trio with a horn like liquid amber. You leaned back and let it wash over you. Kids drank orange soda from cans with pop tops, sharp enough to slice a thumb. The fizz tickled your nose. The can read Kiss Collector Edition or Star Wars Bonus Contest. You didn't care about the prize. You just saved the can, washed it out, and placed it on your windowsill like a shrine. Comic books weren't just entertainment, they were currency. You folded your homework between pages of Fantastic Four, hid your love notes behind Wonder Woman. The covers faded in the sun, but inside they held battles, heartbreaks, and answers to questions grown-ups didn't ask. The corner toy store smelled like plastic dust and magic. Pegboards held action figures in crooked rows. Bins overflowed with yo-yos, paddle balls, and tiny green army men. You had $3 and a dream. The old man behind the counter never rushed you. He knew choosing was serious business. In school, kids brought lunch boxes that told their stories. $6 Million Man. Peanuts, Charlie's Angels. The thermos always leaked. The sandwich was warm by noon. But you held it like armor in the cafeteria, proof of identity in a world of mystery meat and milk cartons. Public pools had no rules, or too many to remember. Lifeguards with whistles and mirrored sunglasses. Chain link fences hot to the touch. You ran anyway. Dove too soon. Came up laughing with your nose burning and your eyes red. You never brought a towel. You borrowed time. At block parties, the fire hydrant was the headliner. Someone jammed a wrench and let the water spray 10 feet high. Kids ran through like warriors. Mothers yelled. Fathers watched from stoops, beers in hand. Your shoes squished for hours. Your heart stayed light for days. And at night, when the TV hummed its closing anthem, when the street outside finally quieted, you sat by the window, peeling the label off a soda bottle, wondering what tomorrow would sound like and if it might come wrapped in comic paper music and a little bit of mischief. The last train to Brooklyn rattled like a dying breath. Lights flickered above graffiti-covered seats. You didn't sit near the back. You kept your bag close and your gaze forward. But sometimes, between Borough Hall and Hoyt Schermerhorn, the car fell silent and you caught your reflection in the window older than it should be. The neighborhood barbershop was part confessional, part comedy club. 2 chairs, a stack of old Jet magazines, clippers buzzing like hornets. You walked in for a trim and walked out knowing who was pregnant, who got arrested, and who swore he saw Lee jogging in Prospect Park. Truth optional, laughter mandatory. The dry cleaner on the corner smelled like starch mothballs and citrus detergent. Your dad's shirts hung behind plastic like soldiers at attention. Mr. Cho always had the news on, in Korean, a pencil behind his ear, and a nod that meant next Tuesday. You trusted him with silk suede secrets. The blackout of '77 returned like a ghost. Not as fierce maybe, but just as quiet. The fridge stopped humming. The fan stuttered and died. And for once, the entire building opened its windows, lit candles, and talked. Someone brought out peanut butter sandwiches. Someone else had a guitar. You shared more that night than all year. Children played in stairwells like they were castles. The lights barely worked. The banister wobbled. but their voices echoed like hope rising through the shaft like morning prayers. You told them to be careful. They nodded but kept playing. They knew how to find joy in the shadows. The hardware store on the avenue sold everything. You didn't think you needed: rubber stoppers, light bulbs no one used anymore, metal keys carved on the spot. The owner wore suspenders and spoke 5 languages, none fluently. You once asked for duct tape and left with life advice. It stuck. Nights when your mom worked late, dinner was toast with peanut butter and banana slices. You sat on the linoleum floor, radio beside you, legs crossed like a monk. The dial glowed orange. A voice from across the river told you stories between songs. You didn't know his name, but he knew you. Street lamps blinked above stoops like tired eyes. You sat there with friends, legs dangling, sharing sunflower seeds and gossip. A car alarm went off somewhere. A couple argued in Spanglish across the street. Someone practiced saxophone 4 floors up. The city never really slept, it just changed rhythms. You wore layers in fall, not for fashion, but survival. A thermal, under a turtleneck, under a flannel, under a windbreaker. You looked like a walking pile of laundry, but the wind couldn't find you. And when your friend said, "Let's walk to the deli," you said yes, because warmth came from movement and company. There was a payphone near the laundromat that never worked right, but you always tried it, dropped in a dime, pressed hard on the receiver. Sometimes you got a dial tone, sometimes a click, and once, just once, your cousin in the Bronx picked up. "How'd you get this number?" She laughed. You never told her. The bakery on the corner had fogged up windows all winter. A bell above the door jingled when you pushed it open. Inside smelled like cinnamon yeast and something your grandmother used to hum. You didn't need much: a jelly donut maybe, or a Kaiser roll still warm. The man behind the counter knew your name. That was enough. Drugstores had wooden floors that creaked when you walked. The pharmacist wore a tie and knew your mother's blood pressure. Wind chimes hung on the door. You came for cough syrup and stayed to read comic books on the spinning rack. No one rushed you. No one needed to. Street fairs turned entire blocks into magic. Paper lanterns, meat on sticks, lemonade in waxy cups, a brass band playing "Ain't No Mountain High Enough" just off key. You won a goldfish in a plastic bag and named it after your uncle. It died in 3 days. You cried anyway. Storefronts had awnings striped like beach chairs and window displays that changed with the seasons: cardboard snowflakes in winter, paper pumpkins in October. You pressed your nose to the glass, watching a toy train circle a tiny plastic village, and wondered if anyone ever lived there. The schoolyard at dusk was church. No walls, no pews, just fence shadows and soft light falling across blacktop. A stickball bat leaning against the wall. A sneaker left behind. You sat on the steps with your backpack open, not ready to go home, not ready for the day to end. Old men played chess in the park on splintered tables, arguing in 6 languages. Their hands trembled, but their moves were swift. You watched quietly, holding your breath. When someone reached for a knight, no one said you could play. But when one of them patted the bench, you knew you'd been seen. Back then, October arrived with a softness: sweaters pulled from boxes that smelled of cedar apples wrapped in paper bags, the distant thump of a football against a brick wall. The whole city seemed to inhale, to pause. Even pigeons flew slower. Even cabs honked less. The radio stations counted down the top 100 songs at year's end. You sat cross-legged on the carpet, pencil in hand, writing them down one by one like they were commandments. When number one finally came, something by the Bee Gees or Stevie Wonder, you smiled like the city had chosen the right one. Sometimes, the elevator stopped between floors for no reason, and you'd stand there alone with your reflection in the metal, hearing the building breathe. You weren't scared, you were still. Like the city had asked you to wait with it just for a moment before the next thing arrived. And one afternoon, maybe in late '79, you walked down your block and realized something had changed. The air smelled different. The sounds were sharper. Kids didn't wave like they used to. A record store had become a fast food place. The man with the shoe shine box wasn't on his corner anymore. You stood there, hands in your jacket pockets, and felt the whole decade exhale. But you kept walking, because the city always moved. Because, even in forgetting, it remembers you.